Every November, on the Yamal Peninsula in northwestern Siberia, a migration begins that has been repeating for longer than any written record on Earth. Across a frozen landscape larger than the entire country of France, the Nenets people guide herds of reindeer, numbering over 10,000 animals across 300 miles of Arctic tundra, roughly the distance from London to Edinburgh. The animals move in columns so vast that from the air they look like dark rivers flowing across white snow. The Nenets sleep in reindeer hide tents called chums. They eat reindeer meat, they drink reindeer milk, they wear reindeer fur. Their sleds are pulled by reindeer. Their entire civilization, spanning at least 2,000 years, is built on the back of one species. But less than 200 miles south of those migration routes, in the thick boreal forests of northern Russia, lives another member of the deer family, one that is twice the size of a reindeer, carries far more meat on its frame, and has shared the same frozen landscape with humans for just as long. The moose. Standing over 6 feet tall at the shoulder, taller than most professional basketball players before you even count the antlers, and weighing as much as 500 pounds, roughly the weight of a compact sedan, the moose is the largest deer species that has ever walked the modern Earth. So here is the question that has puzzled wildlife biologists and anthropologists for decades. If ancient humans figured out how to domesticate the reindeer, why did no one ever manage to domesticate the moose? The answer turns out to be far more complicated and far more revealing than you might expect. And it took centuries of failed experiments, including one very ambitious Soviet agricultural program, to prove the point. Nobody was asking this question 12,000 years ago. In the millennia following the retreat of the last great ice sheets, both reindeer and moose were simply prey. Rock art scattered across the coastal cliffs of Scandinavia, the river valleys of Siberia, and the boreal forests of northern Canada depicts hunters stalking both species. They drove them toward cliff edges. They trapped them in constructed enclosures of stone and timber. They ambushed them at river crossings during seasonal migrations when the animals were vulnerable and slow. To the earliest inhabitants of the subarctic world, these two animals were food sources and nothing more. One of them carried a set of behavioral traits that, over thousands of years, would allow an extraordinary transformation. Reindeer would go from wild quarry to managed herds, from hunted prey to the cornerstone of entire civilizations across the top of the world. Moose would remain wild, solitary, and in many documented cases, lethal to the very humans who tried to bring them under control. That divergence, the reason one of these animals walks beside humans today while the other charges at them, reveals something fundamental about what domestication actually requires, and it is a lesson that took researchers decades and considerable physical danger to fully understand. To understand why reindeer cooperated, you have to understand how they think. Reindeer are herd animals at the deepest level of their behavioral architecture. Their survival strategy for the past 2 million years has been built entirely on safety in numbers. A lone reindeer standing on open tundra is a dead reindeer. Wolves hunt them in coordinated packs. Wolverines ambush them in deep snow. Brown bears stalk them during calving season. Golden eagles take their newborn calves. The defense against all of these threats is the herd itself, a moving mass of hundreds or thousands of animals where any single individual is statistically unlikely to be the one taken down on any given day. This herding instinct means reindeer naturally follow a leader. In wild populations, experienced older females typically lead seasonal migrations across hundreds of miles of tundra, and the rest of the herd follows in their tracks. When humans stepped into that leadership role, the reindeer did not resist the change. They simply transferred their instinct to follow from a dominant cow to a human handler. That behavioral slot, the willingness to accept an external authority figure guiding the direction and pace of movement, was already built into the species. Humans did not have to create it. They just had to occupy it. There is another detail that made reindeer peculiarly suited for human management, and it involves something most people would never think to connect to the origins of domestication. Reindeer crave salt. Their natural diet of lichens, mosses, and tundra vegetation is extremely low in sodium, and they will travel remarkable distances to find mineral licks. Early subarctic humans noticed that reindeer would approach their camps uninvited and lick the ground where urine had been deposited. drawn by the sodium and mineral salts it contained. This is not folklore or romantic speculation. Ethnographic accounts from multiple reindeer herding cultures describe the deliberate use of urine as an animal management tool. The Finnish linguist and ethnographer T.I. Itkinen documented this practice among the Sami people of northern Scandinavia in the 1940s. Herders would urinate in the snow near camp to draw scattered reindeer closer to the settlement, creating a repeated positive association between human scent and a valued mineral resource. Over generations spanning centuries, this simple interaction formed one of the behavioral foundations of the entire domestication process. Human provides salt. Reindeer approaches voluntarily. Proximity becomes routine. Familiarity replaces fear. And over hundreds of years of repetition, the relationship transforms from a transaction into a partnership. Reindeer also possess a temperament that, while not exactly docile, falls within the range that humans can manage. They startle when a predator appears. They bolt when genuinely threatened. But their flight response is short and controllable compared to many wild ungulates. A spooked reindeer runs a few hundred meters across the tundra and then stops to look back at whatever startled it. It does not run until it collapses from exhaustion. It does not smash blindly into fences, walls, or barriers with the kind of self-destructive panic that characterizes many wild species when they feel trapped. This tolerance of proximity, combined with a tendency to calm quickly after being frightened, made reindeer manageable inside corrals, pens, and fenced grazing areas from a very early stage. And critically, reindeer breed reliably in captivity. Female reindeer reach sexual maturity at roughly 18 months and typically produce one calf per year, with a gestation period of about 230 days, slightly over 7 months. They do not require elaborate courtship rituals, specific environmental conditions, or carefully maintained habitat features to mate. Place bulls and cows together in a managed space, and reproduction happens on schedule. This sounds like a minor detail, but it is one of the most important and most overlooked prerequisites for domestication. Many wild species simply refuse to breed when confined. Their reproductive systems shut down under the physiological stress of captivity. Reindeer do not have that problem. They breed in corrals nearly as reliably as they breed on open tundra, which meant that humans could begin selecting for desirable traits within a few generations of beginning management. One additional adaptation deserves mention, because it explains why the partnership between humans and reindeer functioned even during the harshest months of the Arctic year. Reindeer eyes undergo a seasonal transformation unlike anything found in any other mammal. In summer, the tapetum lucidum behind their retinas reflects golden light, adapted for the constant brightness of the Arctic summer when the sun never sets. In winter, the same tissue shifts to a deep blue, dramatically increasing light sensitivity and allowing the animals to see clearly in the near-total darkness of the polar night. This means reindeer can navigate snowfields, locate buried lichen, and respond to herders during the months of perpetual darkness that define life above the Arctic Circle from November through January. An animal that went functionally blind in winter darkness would have been useless to a herding culture. Reindeer evolved exactly the opposite, a visual system tuned to the same extreme light conditions that their human partners had to survive. The timeline of reindeer domestication has been debated among archaeologists for decades, and the answer depends partly on where you draw the boundary between organized hunting, active management, and full domestication. If domestication means complete human control of breeding, movement patterns, and genetic selection, the clearest evidence points to roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years ago in the mountains of southern Siberia. Genetic analyses published in 2017 by researchers at the Russian Academy of Sciences showed that domestic reindeer populations in the Sayan Mountains, near the modern border between Russia and Mongolia, diverged genetically from their wild counterparts approximately 2,000 years ago. That kind of genetic divergence is consistent with a sustained period of selective breeding and population management, the hallmarks of full domestication. But if you expand the definition to include earlier forms of management and control, the timeline stretches much further back. Rock carvings at Alta in northern Norway, now designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, date to between 7,000 and 2,000 years ago. The carved stone panels along the fjord depict scenes that many researchers interpret as early reindeer management. Animals are shown being funneled between constructed barriers toward groups of waiting humans, corralled into enclosed areas, and in some interpretations led across the landscape by individuals walking ahead on foot. Whether these images show organized communal hunting or the early stages of herding is still debated in the archaeological literature, but the practical techniques depicted are nearly identical. Channeling reindeer through constructed funnels to hunt them, and channeling reindeer through constructed funnels to herd them, involved the same infrastructure, the same behavioral knowledge, and the same species-level understanding. The difference is intent, not method. And intent does not fossilize. In 2014, archaeologist Robert Luzzi of the University of Alberta published research analyzing ancient dog and human remains from the Lake Baikal region of eastern Siberia. His findings demonstrated that early dog domestication in the region was deeply intertwined with reindeer hunting strategies dating back at least 8,000 years. The dogs were being used to manage and redirect reindeer movements during hunts, performing a function that is nearly indistinguishable from the herding dogs used by modern Sami and Ninets pastoralists today. The transition from using dogs to drive reindeer toward kill zones to using dogs to guide reindeer toward grazing areas may have been so gradual that no single generation of humans experienced it as a distinct change. The Sami people of Scandinavia followed a path of their own. Early Sami interactions with reindeer likely began as an intensive form of hunting, with human groups following wild herds across the mountain plateaus and tundra of what is now Norway, Sweden, and Finland, gradually exerting more control over migration routes and calving grounds. Archaeological evidence from the Varanger Peninsula in northern Norway, published by Knut Helskog of the Arctic University of Norway, shows pit trap systems dating to over 3,000 years ago that were clearly engineered to exploit reindeer behavior. These were not random holes in the ground. They were coordinated landscape modifications designed to channel animals along specific corridors toward predetermined capture points. The investment required to build and maintain these systems suggests a depth of knowledge about reindeer ecology, migration timing, and behavioral responses that sits right on the border between hunting and management. Further west and north, among the Nenets and Khanty peoples of the Ob River Basin in western Siberia, reindeer management developed into the massive-scale pastoralism that continues today. By roughly 1,000 years ago, Nenets herders were guiding herds of several thousand animals across seasonal migration routes spanning over 700 miles, a distance comparable to driving from New York City to Chicago, and sustaining entire communities on nothing but the products of a single domesticated species. If you are finding this kind of deep dive useful, subscribe now. The algorithm stops recommending this channel if you do not engage, and what comes next in this story is the part that explains why some animals simply cannot be bent to human purposes regardless of how much effort, ingenuity, or determination gets thrown at the problem. The Duka people, also called the Tsatan, still herd reindeer today in the mountains of northern Mongolia. Their herds are small by Nenet standards, typically between 30 and 100 animals, about the size of a school classroom. But their relationship with the species is arguably the most intimate of any herding culture. The Duka ride their reindeer through mountain forests. They milk them daily. They live among them in camps made from birch poles and canvas, relocating every few weeks to follow the lichen growth. A Duka family without reindeer is, in their own cultural framework, barely a family at all. The Evenki people of central Siberia developed their own distinct riding culture, using small wooden saddles fitted to the reindeer's back for travel across terrain that would defeat any other form of transportation. An Evenki rider on reindeer could navigate deep snow, frozen bogs, and forested mountain slopes with a speed and efficiency that nothing else in the subarctic could match. Without the reindeer, the vast interior of Siberia, a landmass larger than the entire continent of Australia, would have remained uninhabited by permanent human communities. What reindeer provided in return for management was, in practical terms, everything an Arctic population needed to stay alive. Meat and fat for calories during months when temperatures dropped to 50 or 60 degrees below zero. Blood mixed with flour for iron-rich emergency nutrition during long winter migrations between grazing grounds. Milk with a fat content of roughly 20%, approximately 6 times richer than the cow's milk sitting in your refrigerator right now. providing concentrated energy in a climate where the human body burns through thousands of extra calories each day just maintaining core temperature. Hides for clothing, tents, and bedding. Sinew for sewing thread and binding cord. Bone and antler for tools, needles, and knife handles. And above all, transportation. A trained reindeer pulling a loaded sled can haul over 300 pounds, roughly the weight of 2 full-sized adults, across snow-covered tundra, at a pace that would leave a person walking beside it in the distance within an hour. The Chukchi people of far northeastern Siberia, living along the edge of the Bering Strait within sight of Alaska on clear days, managed herds that numbered in the tens of thousands and represented the single greatest concentration of domesticated animal wealth in the Arctic world. The entire Chukchi social structure, from marriage arrangements to inheritance customs to political authority, was organized around reindeer ownership. A family's standing was measured by the size of its herd, and conflicts between Chukchi groups over reindeer were a defining feature of regional history for centuries. Every aspect of survival in the northern latitudes, from shelter to clothing to food to mobility to social organization, was transformed by one act of domestication. And across that entire span of thousands of years and millions of square miles of Arctic territory, the moose was right there, inhabiting the same forests, feeding from the same landscape, growing to twice the size of a reindeer, carrying enough meat on a single frame to feed a family for weeks. Not a single human culture on any continent in any era ever managed to domesticate it. On paper, the moose should have been a better domestication candidate than the reindeer. A mature bull moose yields between 400 and 700 pounds of usable meat from a single kill, the equivalent of butchering 3 to 4 full-grown reindeer at once. Moose hides are thick, durable, and large enough to cover substantial surface area for shelter construction. Moose can swim for hours, crossing wide rivers and deep lakes that reindeer cannot navigate. And moose occupy the boreal forest belt stretching across Canada, Scandinavia, Finland, and Russia, overlapping almost perfectly with the historical range of domestic reindeer. The word moose itself offers a clue about why domestication never worked. It comes from the Eastern Algonquian languages of northeastern North America. In the Narragansett tongue, moose meant he strips, a reference to the animal's habit of stripping bark and twigs from trees with its muscular, prehensile upper lip. The name describes exactly what the animal does every waking hour. And that feeding behavior, as researchers would eventually discover, is one of several reasons that domestication was never going to succeed. But the feeding problem was only one piece of a much larger failure. The deeper barrier was behavioral. And the full scale of that behavioral mismatch is something that scientists did not completely appreciate until a series of ambitious, expensive, and often physically dangerous experiments in the 20th century laid it out in terms that could not be ignored. In 1997, the biologist and geographer Jared Diamond published Guns, Germs, and Steel, in which he outlined what he called the Anna Karenina principle of animal domestication. The name comes from the opening line of Tolstoy's famous novel. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Diamond applied the same logic to domesticated animals. Successfully domesticated species all share a specific set of behavioral and biological prerequisites, but each species that failed domestication failed for its own particular reason. Moose managed to fail on nearly all of them at once. The first and most fundamental barrier is social structure. Reindeer are herd animals. Moose are solitary. Outside of the brief mating season in autumn, adult moose do not form groups. They do not follow leaders. They do not coordinate their movements with other moose. They do not recognize or defer to dominant individuals in any sustained way. A bull moose occupies a home range of 5 to 50 square miles, an area that can encompass entire valleys and mountain ridges, and actively avoids other bulls for roughly 10 months of every year. A cow moose with calves is territorial and will attack anything that approaches her offspring, including other moose that wander too close. This solitary nature means there is no social hierarchy for humans to exploit. The domestication of herd animals works precisely because those animals already possess a built-in behavioral system of following a dominant individual. Humans insert themselves into that hierarchy as the new leader. With moose, there is no hierarchy to insert yourself into. There is no herd instinct to redirect. Each moose operates as a behaviorally independent animal, answering to nothing and deferring to no one. This is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. The aggression of moose is not a seasonal quirk or a response to unusual stress. It is a baseline feature of the species, built into the animal's behavioral wiring as deeply as the herding instinct is built into reindeer. Moose cause more human injuries per year across Scandinavia and North America than bears and wolves combined. In Sweden alone, moose vehicle collisions cause approximately 6,000 accidents every single year, a number roughly equivalent to every resident of a small Swedish town being involved in a collision annually. And the moose standing in the middle of a road at dusk does not behave the way a white-tailed deer does. A deer freezes in the headlights or bolts for the tree line. A moose stands its ground, or it charges the vehicle. During the rut, which runs from September through October, bull moose undergo hormonal changes that transform them into some of the most dangerous large mammals on the continent. Testosterone floods through the animal system. Bulls become territorial, confrontational, and willing to charge anything they perceive as a rival or a threat. That category includes other moose, humans on foot, parked vehicles, and on documented occasions, freight trains. A charging bull moose at full speed covers ground at 35 miles per hour, faster than Usain Bolt at his world record pace, and delivers an impact that wildlife managers in Alaska have compared to being struck by a motorcycle traveling at highway speed. Cow moose defending their calves in spring and early summer are equally dangerous. Wildlife biologist Victor van Ballenberghe, who spent over 2 decades studying moose populations in the Matanuska Valley and Denali region of Alaska for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, documented case after case of cow moose attacking hikers, cyclists, dog walkers, and even people simply standing in their own yards who happened to be within 50 meters of a hidden calf. The maternal defense response in moose is not a warning display or a bluff charge. It is a committed, sustained assault using the front hooves. Those hooves are sharp-edged, bone-backed, and driven by legs that can kill a full-grown wolf with a single kick. In Alaska, moose send more people to emergency rooms every year than any other wild animal in the state. Think about that for a second. Not bears. Not wolves. Moose. If you have made it this far into the video, you clearly want to understand the deep biological forces that shaped which animals humans could control and which ones remained forever beyond reach. That is exactly what this channel covers, every single week. Hit subscribe so the next video shows up in your feed automatically. What comes next is even stranger than what you have heard so far. Because what comes next is the time an entire national government decided to prove all of this wrong, and spent decades trying. In the late 1940s, the Soviet government authorized a series of agricultural experiments aimed at exploiting the economic potential of Russia's native wildlife. The reasoning was characteristically Soviet in its ambition. The boreal forests of Russia contained an estimated 700,000 wild moose, scattered across a territory spanning 11 time zones. Each of those animals represented hundreds of pounds of meat, liters of nutritionally dense milk, and a hide large enough for multiple industrial applications. If moose could be domesticated and farmed the way cattle were managed in temperate climates, the protein output from Russia's northern territories could theoretically multiply many times over. The most sustained and well-documented effort took place at what is now known as the Sumarokovo Moose Farm in the Kostroma Oblast of central Russia, roughly 200 miles northeast of Moscow. Formally established as a dedicated research station in 1963 under the supervision of wildlife biologist Yevgeny Knore, the farm began its work with wild moose calves captured from the surrounding birch and pine forests. Researchers discovered early on that if a moose calf was separated from its mother within the first 24 hours of life and immediately bottle-fed by a human handler, the calf would imprint on that specific person. It would follow the handler through the forest. It would accept physical contact. It would display behaviors that, to an observer who did not know the full story, looked remarkably like tameness. The initial results were encouraging enough to keep the program funded for years. Researchers managed to train individual moose cows to stand calmly for milking. Moose milk turned out to be extraordinarily nutritious, containing roughly 12% fat and 8% protein, numbers that made it 3 to 4 times more calorie-dense per glass than the cow's milk sold in Moscow grocery stores. Soviet medical researchers explored its use as a clinical supplement for patients with stomach ulcers and gastrointestinal inflammation, and several studies reported positive results. Some moose at the farm were trained to pull sleds and carry light loads through dense forest terrain, wading through snowdrifts that would have stopped horses and even reindeer in their tracks. The moose's extraordinarily long legs, evolved over millions of years for navigating deep snowpack and tangled boreal underbrush, gave the animal a natural advantage in exactly the kind of terrain where conventional pack animals were useless. But these individual successes concealed a structural problem that no amount of training could fix. Every advance at the Kostroma farm was personal, not systemic. Each moose had to be hand-raised by one specific handler from the first hours of its life. Each moose cow responded only to the person it had imprinted on as a calf. If a different handler attempted to approach, the animal became agitated, refused to cooperate, or attacked. There was no transferability of trust between humans. The moose did not generalize its acceptance of one person into a tolerance of humans as a category. It recognized one individual. Everyone else remained a potential threat to be confronted or fled from. This is the precise opposite of how domestication functions at the population level. When you domesticate a species, you are selecting for generalized tolerance of all humans, not bonding with one specific individual. A dairy cow does not need to be raised by the same farmer who milks her every morning. A domestic horse does not require a lifelong personal relationship with one rider to accept a saddle. Domestic animals recognize the human species as non-threatening. Moose at the Kostroma farm, after 60 years of effort, still have not made that leap. The breeding program ran into walls that were, if anything, even harder. Bull moose at the farm could not be safely handled during the autumn rut. Captive rearing did not diminish their hormonal aggression by any measurable degree. A hand-raised bull moose in breeding season behaved with exactly the same territorial violence as a wild bull, except that the hand-raised animal was more dangerous in practice. A wild bull moose encountering a human will often retreat, because it has learned through experience that humans are unpredictable. A farm-raised bull moose has no fear of humans whatsoever, but it retains every gram of its species-level aggressive instinct. The combination of fearlessness and aggression created situations that farm staff described as genuinely terrifying. Fences were smashed, buildings were damaged, handlers were chased and injured. The herd at Kostroma never exceeded roughly 40 animals at any one time, about the number of students you would find in a single high school classroom. Compare that number to the Nenets herders of the Yamal Peninsula, who manage herds of 10,000 reindeer or more. That is a ratio of 250 to 1. The scaling problem was not a question of funding or commitment. It was a question of species biology. Every moose required its own individual handler. Every moose cow had to be milked by the one person she recognized. Every bull became a danger to everyone around him for months, each autumn. The economics of industrial-scale moose farming never came within sight of viability. The Sumarokovo moose farm still exists today, surrounded by the birch forests and river meadows of the Kostroma region. It operates primarily as a tourist destination and biological research station. Visitors can pet young moose calves during supervised encounters and purchase small jars of moose milk. But nobody in 6 decades of work has figured out how to convert what happens at that small farm into anything resembling the continent-spanning pastoralism that humans achieved with reindeer over 2,000 years ago. The experiment did not fail because the Soviet Union lacked ambition, scientific talent, or resources. It failed because moose biology is, at a structural level, incompatible with what domestication demands. The Soviets were not the first to try bending the moose to human purposes. 3 centuries before the Kostroma farm, the Swedish military explored the idea of riding moose into battle. Historical accounts from the 17th century describe experiments reportedly conducted during the reign of King Charles XI of Sweden, in which soldiers attempted to train moose as cavalry mounts for winter warfare. The reasoning behind the project was tactically sound. Swedish military campaigns regularly took place across the deep winter snows of Scandinavia, Finland, and the Baltic territories. Cavalry horses struggled in heavy snowpack. Their legs sank. Their hooves slipped on ice. They burned energy at unsustainable rates trying to move through drifts. A moose with legs proportionally much longer than any horses and broad, splayed hooves specifically evolved for walking on snow and soft bog, could cover frozen terrain where horses were functionally useless. A unit of moose cavalry operating in the forests and tundra of the far north would have held a devastating tactical advantage over any horse-mounted force. Two problems destroyed the program before it ever reached an actual battlefield. First, moose panicked completely at the sound of gunfire. A cavalry mount that bolts in blind terror at the first musket discharge is not merely ineffective, it is a lethal hazard to its own rider. Unlike horses, which can be gradually desensitized to loud noises through repeated controlled exposure, the moose showed zero capacity for habituation to sudden explosive sounds. The startle response was total, it was immediate, and it was permanent regardless of how many times the animal heard the noise. Second, moose housed in stables alongside horses contracted diseases that their immune systems had never encountered in the wild. The pathogens of barn environments, organisms that domestic horses had co-evolved with over thousands of years, swept through the moose populations with devastating speed. The animals had no resistance. Mortality was catastrophic. The Swedish moose cavalry program was quietly abandoned. The moose returned to the forests. The horses stayed in the stables, and the idea of using the largest deer on Earth as a weapon of war joined the long catalog of human ambitions that collided with biological reality and lost. Beyond behavior, aggression, and panic, moose present a feeding challenge that would have defeated any ancient herding culture and remains impractical even with modern agricultural technology. Moose are browsers, not grazers. That single distinction explains more about the failure of moose domestication than almost any other factor. Grazers eat grass. Browsers eat the leaves, twigs, bark, and shoots of woody shrubs and trees. Moose feed primarily on willow, birch, aspen, balsam fir, and aquatic vegetation like water lilies and pondweed during the summer months. In winter, when the lakes freeze and aquatic plants are unreachable, they strip bark from tree trunks and eat the tips of branches projecting above the snowline. A single adult moose eats between 40 and 60 pounds of this woody material every day. That is the equivalent of stuffing a large suitcase with tree branches and feeding it to the animal every 24 hours. In summer, moose supplement their browse diet by wading chest-deep into lakes and ponds, submerging their massive heads entirely underwater to tear up aquatic vegetation from the bottom. A moose can hold its breath for over 30 seconds while feeding in this position, an impressive adaptation for a 500-pound land mammal, but not the kind of feeding behavior that translates to managed agriculture. The browse-based diet of moose cannot be replicated in captivity at any workable scale. You cannot plant a pasture of willow shoots and birch bark the way you seed a field of hay or oat grass. The woody vegetation moose regenerates slowly after being consumed. A forest stand stripped of its accessible browse by even a small number of moose takes years to grow back enough material to sustain another round of feeding. At the Kostroma farm, workers had to drive into the surrounding forests every single day, cut fresh branches, load them onto trucks, and deliver them to the moose by hand. The labor required to feed 40 animals was a significant daily operation. The labor required to feed 4,000 would mean stripping the forest faster than it could recover. Reindeer eat lichens. Reindeer lichens carpet the tundra and boreal forest floor across millions of square miles of the northern hemisphere. A herd of 10,000 reindeer sustains itself during migration, simply by walking across the landscape and grazing as it moves. The food grows everywhere the reindeer travels. No harvesting by humans. No truck deliveries. No daily labor. The ecosystem provides the feed, and the herd rotates naturally across the landscape in a seasonal pattern that allows previously grazed areas to regenerate before the animals return months or years later. Nearly every large herbivore that humans have successfully domesticated is a grazer or a flexible omnivore that thrives on grass-based diets. Cattle eat grass. Sheep eat grass. Horses eat grass. Goats tolerate grass-dominant diets without difficulty. Animals whose diets depend exclusively on the woody browse of slow-growing forest plants have resisted domestication almost without exception. Their food supply cannot be cultivated, stored, transported, or scaled to match the demands of a growing herd managed by human labor. The moose failure fits into a much larger pattern that defines the outermost limits of what human civilizations have been able to achieve with the animal kingdom. Of the roughly 148 species of large wild terrestrial herbivores that existed on Earth during the period when humans were domesticating animals, only 14 were ever successfully brought under permanent human management. 14 out of 148, a success rate of less than 10%. Worse odds than flipping a coin by a factor of 5. Those 14 species all share the same cluster of biological and behavioral traits. They tolerate confinement without destroying themselves. They breed reliably in captivity without requiring elaborate environmental conditions. They mature quickly enough that selective breeding produces visible results within a human lifetime. They eat foods that humans can supply at reasonable scale. They live in social groups, organized by a dominance hierarchy that humans can insert themselves into. And they possess temperaments that, while not always gentle, do not include randomly lethal aggression toward their handlers on an unpredictable schedule. Every other candidate species failed on at least one of these requirements. The consistency of the pattern is striking. Zebras failed on temperament, despite being anatomically almost identical to horses. African and Asian civilizations attempted for centuries to ride, drive, and harness zebras the way Europeans and Central Asians used horses. Every attempt collapsed against the zebra's relentless aggression, its tendency to bite and never release, and its refusal to be led by a rope or rein. Gazelles and most antelope species failed on panic response, injuring and killing themselves against fencing, walls, and each other in blind terror when enclosed. Elephants came tantalizingly close to domestication, but failed on reproductive timelines. An elephant reaches sexual maturity at around 13 years of age and gestates a single calf for 22 months. 20 generations of selective breeding, generally considered the minimum needed to produce consistent changes in a species' behavior, would require over 400 years with elephants. With cattle, those same 20 generations take roughly 60 years. Dmitry Belyaev's landmark silver fox experiment at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk, Russia, demonstrated in the 1950s and 60s that selecting rigorously for tameness alone could produce dramatic domestication-like behavioral and physical changes in as few as 20 generations. But silver foxes reproduce once per year and mature in under 12 months. 20 fox generations is 20 years. Moose reproduce slowly, rarely producing more than 2 calves per pregnancy, and require 2 to 3 years to reach full maturity. 20 moose generations stretches to approximately 50 years. Even if you could safely manage the breeding program, and the Kostroma farm demonstrated that you largely cannot, the timeline for achieving meaningful genetic selection results in moose spans multiple human lifetimes. The Anna Karenina principle holds perfectly. Every successfully domesticated species is alike. Each failed candidate species is failed in its own way. Moose found a way to fail on almost every criterion simultaneously. Solitary social structure with no hierarchy to exploit. Extreme, hormonally driven aggression in both sexes. A specialized browse diet that cannot be scaled by human agriculture. Slow reproductive maturation that defeats selective breeding. Panic and destructive behavior in confined spaces. An inability to generalize trust from one imprinted handler to humans as a category. Each of these failures alone would have been sufficient to prevent domestication. Together they form a barrier that no human civilization, no government program, and no military operation has managed to breach. Of all the large mammals that have walked this planet alongside human beings, fewer than 1 in 10 could ever be brought into the human world. Drop a comment and tell me which wild animal you think came closest to domestication without ever getting there. I read every comment on this channel, and the best answers get featured. The story of the moose and the reindeer reveals something that reaches far beyond the boreal forests of the northern hemisphere. It reveals the extent to which human civilization was shaped not by human will, but by the biological characteristics of the animals humans happen to share a landscape with. The Nenets did not choose reindeer through some deliberate process of comparative evaluation. The Sami did not sit around a fire and decide that reindeer were superior candidates to moose. What happened was less dramatic and more consequential than any decision. The reindeer allowed itself to be managed. It came to human camps seeking salt. It followed when led, It bred in captivity. It fed itself on lichen that grew everywhere across the tundra. Over centuries of small interactions repeated across hundreds of human and reindeer generations, the relationship deepened from cautious hunting to loose management to full pastoralism. The reindeer cooperated with the process, and the Nenets, the Sami, the Evenki, the Chukchi, and dozens of other Arctic peoples built their entire civilizations on the back of that cooperation. The moose cooperated with none of it. Every human culture in the circumpolar north hunted moose. Many depended on moose meat to survive the winter. But when those same cultures tried to manage moose the way they managed reindeer, the animal pushed back at every single point. Not through any kind of deliberate resistance, but through the accumulated weight of millions of years of solitary evolution that had shaped a creature fundamentally incompatible with the behavioral requirements of living alongside humans. Valerius Geist, one of the most prominent wildlife ecologists to study the behavioral ecology of large ungulates across a career spanning 4 decades at the University of Calgary, made a point in his published work that seems obvious in retrospect but is almost never stated plainly. Domestication is not something that humans impose on animals by force of will. It is something that can only happen when the right animal encounters the right human culture in the right environmental context. Remove any one of those 3 elements, and domestication does not occur. No quantity of effort, technology, patience, or ambition can replace the biological prerequisites. The reindeer had every one of those prerequisites. The moose had almost none of them. And the 200-mile gap between the Nenets reindeer herds crossing the frozen tundra of the Yamal Peninsula and the solitary moose standing in the birch forests just to the south is not a gap of geography, technology, or human ambition. It is a gap of evolutionary biology, of behavioral architecture, of the invisible molecular and neurological boundaries that separate the animals we live with from the animals we can only watch from a safe distance. The next time you see footage of a bull moose standing at the edge of a boreal clearing, its antlers spanning 6 feet from tip to tip, wider than most doorways you have ever walked through, breath steaming in the cold northern air, consider that your ancestors looked at that exact animal for thousands of years and wanted to bring it into their world. They hunted it. They ate it. They used its hide and its bones. And when they saw what they had achieved with the reindeer, they almost certainly tried to do the same with the moose. It did not work. It was never going to work. The Soviet Union tried with the full backing of a superpower's resources and scientific infrastructure. Sweden tried with the ambitions of a military empire. Neither came close. Some species walk beside us because their biology allows the partnership. Others walk alone because theirs does not. The moose was built for solitude, shaped across millions of years of evolution into an animal whose every behavioral instinct, from its aggression to its feeding habits to its refusal to follow a leader, runs directly against the requirements of domestication. 10,000 years of human ingenuity did not change that, and nothing in the foreseeable future is likely to change it either. The machinery of evolution does not negotiate with human ambition, it simply produces what it produces. And in the case of the moose, what it produced was an animal that is magnificent, enormous, and utterly unwilling to be anything other than wild. If you want to understand what other evolutionary forces shaped the world that humans inherited, click the video on screen right now. It connects directly to everything you just heard. And if you have made it all the way to the end of this one, hit subscribe. This channel goes deep on the biological, geological, and evolutionary forces that built the world before recorded history began, and there is a new video every single week. I will see you in the next one.